Thank you for joining us for another episode of Simplify. We're going to go over a study today of Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. Many people will use this passage of verses to say that God's Sabbath has now been transformed into a spiritual Sabbath. Sabbath every day, Sabbath any day, just rest. God just wants you to be able to spend time with him, just rest. It's not about religion, it's about relationship. And nobody can tell you how to have your relationship with God. That's between you and God. Just rest, the spiritual Sabbath. And they use Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, amongst many other texts, to try to back that up. But what we want to do today is we want to look at Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 11 and see what it actually means. We're going to be using the King James Version of the Bible. And I know many of you prefer the Amplified Bible, the New International Bible, whatever other Bible versions you're using. But we're going to use the King James Version of the Bible today, and I will explain to you why. Have you ever played a game where you whisper to the person next to you, and they whisper to the person next to them, and the message goes all the way around the room? By the time it gets back to you, the message has totally changed. Well, if you pay attention, those who have the message that's closest to you, when you gave it, the messages are more accurate than the ones that are further down the line. So we find the same thing when it comes to Bible translations. Check out this slide here. We have the King James Version, which was released in 1611 AD. It's much sooner than a lot of the other versions that came after it. Amplified Bible, 1965. New American Standard Bible, 1971. NIV, 1973. But look when the Old Testament was completed in Hebrew. Look when the New Testament was completed in Greek, 200 BC and in the first century AD. So the King James Version is closest to the original message than the other Bibles. Now you have the Bishop's Bible, Geneva Bible, Coverdale Bible, Tyndale's Bible. Yes, those are even closer, but many people don't have those. Now, if you have a Bible app, or you can get a copy of these, and I too reference these from time to time, but the most common Bible that many people have, that I have, and many people have, is the King James Bible. So we want to stick with a version of the Bible that's closest to the original message, and it makes it easier to understand, especially when we're using a Bible concordance or a dictionary to look up certain words, whether it's in Hebrew or Greek, to make sure that we're getting a definition of the word that is closest to the original message. So before we begin our Bible study, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll jump right into Hebrews chapter 4, starting with verse 1. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1. And again, we're going to go through this verse by verse. It says in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1, "Let us therefore fear lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it." What does this verse mean? What this verse is saying is, let us therefore fear. Let us fear that we leave a promise behind by not entering into his rest. That's what it's saying. If we enter into his rest, there's a promise. Let us fear that we miss out on that promise by not entering into his rest. But what does it mean by entering into his rest? Remember, I said we can avoid or minimize private interpretations by looking up the word and seeing what that word means in its original language. We're reading this in English. The original language of the New Testament was Greek. So let's look rest up in Greek and see what that word rest means. 2663, that word rest means katapausis, which means a reposing down, that is by Hebraism, an abode. I like that word abode. It's a place. It's a place of rest. It's an abode of rest, katapausis. But let me give you an illustration that will really make this make sense. You're traveling down the highway. You see a sign that says rest area ahead. Well, you can pull into this rest area, or you can bypass it and go to the next rest area. Hopefully you're not in an emergency and you make that stop at that rest area. But the rest area is a place of rest. It's an abode of rest. It's a place that you enter into, the rest area, or many would call it, we used to call it rest stop, but it's the rest area. It's katapausis. So when we read in the Bible about entering into his rest, not just any rest, and we're starting in verse 1, and it's identifying a place of rest that is his rest, entering into his katapausis. Look at verse 2. For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. I'm going to step out on a limb and I'm going to say this here. For unto us was the gospel of the Seventh Day Sabbath preached. It was preached to us just like it was preached to them, but it didn't profit them because they didn't have any faith in what they were hearing. Why do I say the Seventh Day Sabbath? The context of this entire conversation in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 1 through 11 is about the Seventh Day Sabbath. We're going to see that. I'm not just making it up. We're going to see that. But let's continue. Hebrews, look at verse 3. For as we which have believed do enter into rest. It's a rest that is entered into. That's katapausis. For we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my katapausis, enter into his katapausis, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. What does this mean? What is this saying? This is saying that we believe and enter into katapausis. But God is saying, enter into my katapausis. Although the works were finished from the foundation of the world, even though the works were finished from the foundation of the world, we're still going to enter into his katapausis, enter into his rest. There are many people that teach that God worked 6 days and he rested the seventh day, but he didn't go back to work. So every day after that was Sabbath. And he wants us to enter into his Sabbath. So every day is Sabbath. That's what a lot of people are teaching. You know, one of the requirements of keeping God's Sabbath is to rest from your work. Meaning every day you can't work, but then they'll twist that it's not a physical rest. It's a spiritual rest. You can still work, but it's a spiritual rest. But God didn't do a spiritual rest. He stopped creating stuff. He stopped making stuff. That's why we got to stick to the scripture. That's why we got to look up these words and see what they mean. But even though he's saying, even though the works were finished from the foundation of the world, we who believe still enter into katapausis, his rest, katapausis. Look at verse 4. For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, meaning he spoke about this. What did he speak about? And God did rest the seventh day from all his works. For he, who is he? Let's step out on another limb here. He is referring to God. For God spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise. Question. Did God ever come to a certain place and speak about the seventh day? In so much that he referenced himself resting on the seventh day. Exodus chapter 20. That certain place is Mount Sinai. On Mount Sinai, he spake in a certain place of the seventh day. He spake in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Then it says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and he rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. He spake in a certain place. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. He spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise. Right? Then it says, and God did rest. But that rest isn't an entered into rest. It says, and God did rest. What did that rest mean? That rest means katapauo, We're going to look it up here. God did rest. Katapao. Katapao. God did rest. What does it mean? To settle down, to cause to desist or cease. He rested from his labor, his work on the seventh day. Let's make this clear here. So again, you're driving down the highway. You see a sign that says rest area. You enter into it. It's a place of rest. That's katapausis. But what if you actually pulled over in your car and you took a nap? That's katapao. You ceased from your traveling. You ceased from driving. You're giving yourself rest. You're giving yourself restraint. You're stopping from what you're doing. That is katapao. You have a place of rest that you can enter into. That's katapausis. But when you enter into that place and you actually rest, that's katapao, or you cease from what you're doing. This is what we see that Paul, the Spirit of God is speaking through Paul, referencing what God did. Look at verse 5. And in this place again, talking about this place again, what place? The certain place that was mentioned in verse 4. What was that certain place? That certain place is Mount Sinai. That certain place is Mount Sinai. Now, it says, in this certain place, again in this place, if they shall enter into my rest. Enter into katapausis, a abode, a place of rest. Enter into it, his rest. Look at verse 6. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein. Enter into what? Seeing because of that, because of what? Because of what? Because God did rest the seventh day from the foundation of the world. And he said, enter into his rest, meaning keep his seventh day Sabbath. Seeing, therefore, because of that, it remains that some must enter therein. And they to whom it was first preached enter not in because of unbelief. Who was it first preached to? It was preached to the same people that it was talking about in verse 2. But the word, it says the gospel of the Seventh Day Sabbath was preached to us just like it was preached to them. But the word didn't profit them because they had no faith in what they were hearing. That message is seen again. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter in. You know what must mean? It's not a choice. It's not a choice. You must enter into this rest. If you're a follower of God, you must enter into this rest. Many will say, oh, that's just opinion. But wait, before you say that, we're going to see. We're going to see. But many don't enter into it because they don't believe it. And again, we're after the cross. Many say that this Sabbath was changed at the cross. There are examples of the followers of Christ keeping the Sabbath at the cross. However, we're in Hebrews chapter 4. Look what it says. Verse 7. Again, Paul is reiterating this message over and over through this conversation. Again, he limited a certain day. He who? God. God limited a certain day. You know what a limited certain day is? Or you know what it's not? You know what a limited certain day is not? It's not any day. It's not every day. A limited certain day is a limited certain day. This whole conversation is about a day. See, before I said the gospel of the Seventh Day Sabbath, this whole conversation is about a day. What day? The day God rested on. This whole conversation is about that. Again, he limited a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. Don't harden your heart when you hear this message. Don't brush this off as just he's talking about being in bondage and he's stuck in the old covenant, and Paul is writing in Hebrews. But Paul ain't talking about nothing about the Seventh Day Sabbath. He's just referencing when God rested. Okay, watch this. Verse 8. For if Jesus had given them rest, them who? Those who don't believe and are resting on another day. Those whom the gospel was preached to, but they have no faith in what they heard. They are resting on another day. It says, if Jesus had given them rest, that's not the rest to enter into. That rest is katapao. That rest that is talking about right here is katapao. If God had given them rest, given them restraint, if God had given them rest, if Jesus had given them rest, then what does Paul say? Then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? If Jesus had given them rest and they're resting on another day, wouldn't Jesus have said something about another day? You remember when Jesus says, I go to prepare a place for you. And then he says, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. Then he later states that if it were not so, there are many mansions in my Father's house. If it were not so, I would have told you. Paul is saying if Jesus had given them rest and they're resting on another day, then wouldn't Jesus have afterwards have spoken of another day? But since Jesus didn't speak of another day, look what Paul says. There remaineth. You know what remaineth means? It means it's always been there. It always been there. It ain't go nowhere. It's always been there. There remaineth, therefore, because of that. There remaineth because of that. Because of what? Because Jesus said nothing about another day. There remaineth, because of that, a rest to the people of God. This is where the hammer hits the nail. Because this rest is not katapao. You would think it would be because it doesn't say enter into it. There remaineth therefore a rest. It doesn't say enter into the rest, because anywhere we see enter into rest is katapausis. So we would think this is katapao, but it's not. This is where I respond to those people that say, Paul ain't talking about no 7th Day Sabbath. He ain't talking about that. Watch this. This rest is totally different from katapao and katapausis. This rest is Sabbatismos. A Sabbatism that is figuratively the repose of the Jews, the repose of the Hebrews, the repose of Christianity. It's a derivative of this word, Sabbaton, the Sabbath, the Shabbat, a day of weekly repose from secular avocations. I like the way this other app even breaks it down even further. From the Blue Letter Bible, there remaineth therefore a rest. It's the same wording. We're just going to get a bit more detail on the definition. Sabbatismos. What does Sabbatismos mean? A keeping Sabbath. What else does it mean? It's a Sabbath to keep, a keeping Sabbath. The blessed rest from toils and troubles looked for in the age to come by the true worshipers of God and the true Christians, not Jews, not Hebrews, the true Christians. But why don't people understand that? Why don't they keep that? We'll get to that. It says it's a derivative of this word. We just saw this before. It's going to pull up Sabbaton. We just saw that. Sabbaton. Well, what does Sabbaton mean? What does it mean? The seventh day of the week, the seventh day of each week, which was a sacred festival. It was a sacred festival on which the Israelites were required to abstain from all work. A lot of people are going to see that and say, "Yeah, see, it was the part of the feast days, and the feast days were ended at the cross." I personally believe. I know there's some Hebrew Israelites that don't believe it. I personally believe, from my studies, that the feast days ended at the cross. They ended with the Mosaic law. But don't get stuck on feast days, on the sacred festival or the sacred feast, and don't get stuck on it was what the Israelites were required to do. Because remember, we're talking about Paul. We're talking years after the cross. We're talking about Paul in the book of Hebrews. He says, therefore there remaineth therefore a Sabbatismos, a Sabbaton to the people of God. What does that word mean, Sabbaton? The institution of the Sabbath, the law for keeping holy every seventh day of the week. This is what Paul means when he says, since Jesus said nothing about resting on another day, there remaineth therefore a Sabbatismos, a Sabbaton, a Shabbat, a seventh day of the week Sabbath to the people of God. Verse 10, for he that is entered into his rest, whose rest? God rest. This is the rest that is entered into. It's a katapausis, but it's his katapausis. For whoever enters into God's rest ceases from his own work as God did. How did God cease from his work? He ceased on the seventh day of the week. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Paul says, for he spake in a certain place on Mount Sinai. And again, in that place, he said, enter into his rest, my rest. Again, in that certain place, he limited a certain day. This ain't any day. This ain't pick your own day. This ain't every day. But those people that heard it and didn't believe it, didn't have faith in it, they hardened their hearts. And because of unbelief, they didn't enter into it. And then Paul asks, if Jesus had given them rest and they're resting on another day, wouldn't Jesus have afterwards have said something? But because Jesus didn't say anything, there remaineth therefore a seventh day Sabbath to keep to the people of God. And he that is entered into God's katapausis, God's rest, ceases from his own work as God did. And Paul concludes with this appeal. Let us labor. Let us strive. Let us pursue with diligence and intention. Let us labor, therefore, which means because of that. Let us labor because of that. Because of what? Because Jesus didn't say anything. Because God ceased from his works on the seventh day from the foundation of the world. Because he spake in a certain place, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. He spake in a certain place and limited a certain day. And those to whom it was first preached, they didn't have faith in it. They didn't believe it, so they didn't enter it. Therefore, many must enter therein. Why? Because God requires it. For there remaineth therefore, since he said nothing about another day, there remaineth therefore a seventh day Sabbath to keep to the people of God. Let us labor to enter into that katapausis. Unless, here's the warning, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. Lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. That unbelief causes people to fall. That unbelief causes people not to enter into God's seventh day Sabbath. That unbelief causes people to fall. That unbelief causes people not to enter into God's seventh day Sabbath. Not entering into God's seventh day Sabbath is a result of unbelief. That unbelief is an example of falling. Now, The Seventh Day Sabbath is a part of God's law. It's the fourth commandment. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. Verses 1 through 17 is the entire 10 commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11 is the fourth commandment, talking about the Sabbath. Now, keep in mind, many of us love God. We read our Bibles. We praise Him. We love going to church, some of us. So there are 9 commandments that we pretty much believe in. But that one regarding the Sabbath, did away at the cross. It's no longer valid. It's the old covenant. All of these things that contribute to one's unbelief, all these things that contribute to one not having faith in what they hear. The prophet of God speaks about that in Hosea chapter 4. Hosea chapter 4, verse 6. Look what the prophet of God says. The Spirit of God is speaking through his prophet. Many people quote this verse, and they only quote the first line of it. It says, my people. First of all, God identifies this as my people. Paul says, therefore, there remaineth a Sabbath to keep to the people of God. There are people of God who are not keeping the Sabbath. Therefore, there remaineth a Sabbatismos, a Sabbathon, a Shabbat, a Seventh Day Sabbath to keep to the people of God. Still identifying them as the people of God, but they must enter into it. The Spirit of God is speaking through the prophet Hosea, and he says this, my people, here's that identifying of his people, his belonging, those that belong to him, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Many people have recited that. But when I repeat this, when I read this, I want you to say this, why? So when I read this, I'm going to count down. I want you to say why. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. 3, 2, 1. Because thou hast rejected knowledge. Why are people being destroyed for a lack of knowledge? Because they reject knowledge. Why are people being destroyed for a lack of knowledge? Because they reject knowledge. Now, I want you to ask, what knowledge are they rejecting? So when I read this text, I'm going to start from the beginning. You repeat why. Then when I get to this other part, I'm count down. You repeat, what knowledge are they rejecting? Let's start. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. 3, 2, 1. Why? Because thou hast rejected knowledge. 3, 2, 1. What knowledge are they rejecting? Seeing, which means understanding. You hast forgotten the law of thy God. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Why? Because they reject knowledge. What knowledge are they rejecting? They have forgotten the law of God. You know what that word forgotten means? You remember earlier we talked about looking up a word and it may have 3 definitions and you have to read the 1A, the 2A, the 3A, the 2A, the 1A, the 1A, the 1B, the 1C, the 2A. You know what I'm talking about. It's got different definitions, right? And you have to read each one to figure out which one fits in the context of how it's being used in whatever you're reading. The word forgotten has 3 definitions. It has 3 definitions. So we are in Hosea. So we're in the Old Testament. So when we look up the original word or the definition for these words, we're going to be looking in the Hebrew concordance or the Hebrew dictionary. But let's look at this word forgotten. Right? What does this word forgotten mean? It says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Why? Because they reject knowledge. Well, what knowledge are they rejecting? Seeing or understanding they have forgotten the law of their God. What does that word forgotten mean? That word forgotten is shakak, right? The first of the 3 definitions means to mislay. Now, many of you have had keys and you've mislaid your keys. You put your keys down somewhere and you don't remember where they are. So you have to search and go find them. And sometimes you have to tear up your whole house to find your keys. Some have kept God's law, but now they no longer keep it, and they've pretty much forgotten about it. But unlike the keys, they don't go searching for it so that they can keep it again. Thou hast forgotten the law of thy God. Thou hast mislaid the law of thy God. You put it down, you never picked it out. The next definition of the word forgotten is to be oblivious of. You're oblivious of it. You have no idea that there's even a Seventh Day Sabbath. Why is that? Somewhere down the line, someone stopped teaching it, or it's never been taught. You're oblivious of it. You had no idea. You have no idea. But because you have no idea, God still counts that as his people have forgotten his law. Then you have individuals, it says, from want of memory or attention. Don't even give it space in your memory. Don't you got to worry about that. Don't pay that no attention. Those people, they in the old covenant. They're a cult. That all ended at the cross. Christ has become our Sabbath. Sabbath every day. Sabbath any day. Just rest. It's about relationship. They stuck on religion. Don't give that any space in your mind. Don't give that no attention. Whether you mislaid it, you're oblivious of it, or you're taught from giving it space in your memory, from giving it want of memory or attention. Don't worry about that. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Why? Because they reject knowledge. What knowledge are they rejecting? They have forgotten the law of thy God. The same principle is seen in Hebrews chapter 4 in this whole conversation about the Sabbath. But how does it end? How does it end? Because Jesus said nothing about another day. There remaineth therefore a Sabbatismos, a Shabbat, a Seventh Day Sabbath to the people of God, that they must enter into it. And if they enter into it, they cease from their own work as God did from his. Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief.